Welcome to The Mything Link, a podcast where we explore the undercurrent of mythology that links our modern culture to our ancient stories.
We're your hosts, Dr. Caitlinn
and Dr. Randall,
two professional mythologists who share a passion for music,
a proclivity for all things spooky,
and an insatiable curiosity for the world around us.
The show will cover worldwide mythology, and season 1 will focus on ancient Greek stories,
giving listeners everything they need to know to understand the new Netflix series Kaos.
And most likely several things that they don't. Join us as we talk, laugh, and sing this fall for The Mything Link season 1.
Chaos
Theory. You can link that up. It's appropriately chaotic. This whole situation is appropriately chaotic. Maybe that's it. It's a lesson in chaos. Perfect.
It's a lesson in chaos theory.
Okay. Welcome to The Mything Link.
Woo!
To our episode on Zeus. Exciting stuff over here. The Zeus is loose.
Yeah, he is.
On Chaos, Zeus is portrayed by the one, the only Jeff Goldblum.
I have a little shrine set up to the man, the myth, and the legend in the back corner of my office.
He does. It's actually true. We'll have to post a picture on our Instagram.
We should.
And it brought us so much delight to see Jeff Goldblum's involvement in this project, especially because it's called Kaos. And of course, he famously portrayed a chaos theorist.
A chaotician.
A chaotician.
Sorry.
Excuse me.
It's my favorite movie of all time. Jurassic Park 1993.
Perfect. So yeah, big fans. We're big fans over here. Even if we weren't mythologists, we would be watching this show for our dude Jeff Goldblum here. So we're very excited. And honestly, his involvement as Zeus makes this episode a lot easier on us because we hate Zeus. Like, let's just get it out of the way immediately. Zeus is the absolute worst. And the way that Jeff Goldblum is playing him with this flair for the dramatic of this person that you love to hate, this character you love to hate, has been really enjoyable for me.
Before we get into extrapolating all of this, we should probably give a brief overview of who Zeus was in ancient Greek mythology. So he was the king of the gods who rules on Mount Olympus, which we see in the show, also called the ruler of the sky, the god of thunder and lightning, and sometimes considered the god of weather. And he is a dick. He is an absolute huge dick. I think I'm just always going to come back to this.
Yes, and Zeus is part of a holy trinity, and it's Zeus on Mount Olympus in the sky. We have Poseidon on Earth in the sea, and then we have Hades in the underworld. In the stories of Greek creation, like we talked about in our episode with Prometheus, Zeus was born to Titan parents. And in ancient mythology, he starts off as a Titan and he then becomes identified as an Olympian because he wins the war, the battle against the Titans. And he ushers in like the new era of the Olympians. His symbols are typically a thunderbolt or clouds, lightning, those sorts of things. He's often associated with eagles and bulls as well. We see those two symbols coming up repeatedly in his stories. Already we see like the eagle as his errand boy is kind of a weird way to say that. And I don't know about all of y'all, but I'm sure that a lot of our understanding of Zeus, at least for our generation, these millennials here, comes to us from Disney's Hercules. Right? Like this is like the main portrayal that we have culturally of Zeus here in the US. And it's embarrassing to admit that, but it is what it is, right? A lot of our first introduction to Greek mythology was through Disney's Hercules. I think it was 1997.
The soundtrack to that is still fire.
Oh my gosh, it's incredible.
Oh, so good.
And it's so interesting because in that movie, they overwhelmingly use the Greek names for everybody except Hercules. Hercules is the Roman version of the name. So the Greek version of the name is Heracles. And we're not going to go too deep into the Hercules movie, but just know that the Zeus of ancient Greek mythology is not the kindly, genial, bearded man that you see portrayed in Disney's Hercules.
No.
The real Zeus is completely different, and Kaos absolutely explores that. And we are going to explore that today.
As I was doing research and thinking about Kaos, Zeus's birth story kept popping up in my head. So I'm going to like skip ahead a little bit and just start where Zeus's parents already exist. So Zeus was born to two Titan parents, Cronus and Rhea, and Cronus had been warned that one of his children would eventually kill him. So as each of his children...
Cronus got a prophecy?
Oh, weird. I know, weird. That one of his children...
I thought humans... In Kaos, only humans get prophecies.
Right?
But here we're seeing... That's the ancient Greek sources. The Titans are getting prophecies as well.
So he is afraid of this prophecy, and as each of his children are born, he swallows them whole. So Rhea doesn't really like this, which I think is understandable. So to save her sixth child, who turns out to be Zeus, she tricks Cronus into swallowing a rock, swaddled like a baby, like in baby's clothes, and she hides Zeus with the nymphs on the island of Crete. Where have we heard this story before? Zeus grows up and marries a Titan's daughter named Metis, who's the goddess of prudence, and she warned Zeus not to wage war against Cronus, against his father, without some seriously powerful help. So when Zeus is grown, he returns home in disguise, and he slips a potion or herb, depending on which version of the story you're hearing, into Cronus's drink, which forces him to vom up the 5 other siblings of Zeus, who emerge whole and safe adults. And these whole safe adults are Hestia, Hera, Demeter, Hades, and Poseidon, who were exactly the serious help that Zeus was needing to overthrow Cronus. So this is the battle that takes place that we were talking about in the Prometheus episode, between the new younger gods.
The Titanomachy.
Titanomachy.
Oh, God damn it.
Say that 5 times
That's
fast.
what it's called. Titanomachy, the struggle between the Titans and Olympians for dominance. The clash of the Titans.
The clash of the Titans. All right.
Titanomachy.
Titanomachy. Okay,
so
a battle takes place, and Zeus, in order to get more powerful help to his side, he frees the Cyclopses. How do you how do you make Cyclops plural in English?
Cyclopses. Cyclopsicles. Cyclopeans.
Cycloptopus? I don't know. So he frees the multiple Cyclops from Tartarus, and they're the ones who craft for him these thunderbolts to hurl at the Titans. They also craft Poseidon's trident and Hades' helmet of invisibility. So most of the Titans and the giants side with Cronus, save for, as we've already discussed, Prometheus. And it turns out that the younger gods, Zeus and all of his siblings, prevail and banish the Titans, except for Atlas, who was the strongest and is made to hold up the earth. Cronus is imprisoned in Tartarus, which is the lowest point in the universe, the deep abyss of the underworld, which we'll talk more about, I'm sure, when we get to the Hades episode.
And this is what we see portrayed in Disney's Hercules in the beginning, where the Titans are underneath the ocean, locked in a cage with Zeus's thunderbolts, right? Keeping them trapped in forever.
Yes. So it is foretold to Zeus, gasp, oh no, another prophecy to a divinity, that Metis, his wife, that I just mentioned, would bear a son mightier than Zeus, who would eventually overthrow him and become the new king of the gods. And also that Metis would bear a daughter who would be wiser than Metis. So out of fear, Zeus swallows his pregnant wife. While she's inside of Zeus, she crafts armor, a shield, and a spear for their daughter, Athena, who she raises inside of Zeus's mind. Eventually, a fully formed Athena is inside of Zeus's mind, banging these objects together and giving this god a headache. And so he can't take it anymore. And Hephaestus and Prometheus cut open Zeus's head, and out, fully formed, fully adult, fully cloaked in armor, emerges Athena. Metis, however, stays inside of Zeus. Thus, only half of this prophecy comes true.
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, 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 dun.
Interesting. So we see that Zeus comes from a very violent beginning. And if we want to get all psychological on this, right, we see Zeus as somebody who has inherited the trauma of his parents and is perpetuating that trauma on, right? Now that he has power, he is perpetuating that trauma. And it's really unfortunate. He's kind of the worst. I put here my notes when I was reading through his origin story. This is like kids playing with toy sets on an ant farm, or with toy sets or an ant farm. Like they just, it's purely for their entertainment. Like the gods are not interested. It's so different than the Christian idea that God knows your soul before you're born and you are unique and special in his eyes, right? And he knows you specifically and individually. The Greek gods had no such claims, right?
They don't give a shit.
It was a lot more chaotic,
yeah.
if you want to say it that way.
One of the most interesting parts of the show to me was Zeus and Hera and all the other gods being like, don't be like dad. Don't be like dad. And Zeus going, I don't want to be like dad. I'm not like dad. When the Zeus in these stories is is exactly like their dad.
Zeus is just like his dad?
Spoiler. Oops.
No way. I hate that. So you mean the Zeus of Chaos?
Both. I think even in the show, we see Zeus embodying primordial kind of conflict that Cronus... I'm curious what they'll do, or if they'll give us more insight into him being just like his dad in the future episodes. But based on what we know...
That's something that I've loved about Chaos over and over again, is they make these little references and these little nods to the broader myths, even though they're not like fully bringing them in. They haven't specifically named Kronos.
Right.
One detail I thought was really fun on Chaos is there's a scene where Zeus, in my notes I wrote Zeus is a sadistic motherfucker, and in my document it says statistic motherfucker. There's a scene where Zeus is a bully and he's shooting someone with a thunderbolt, and you see like lightning lighting up through the veins. And I thought that was a fun little detail, a fun little touch. And as he like gets angrier and angrier, you could see the clouds building up behind him and thundering and the storm building. And I love that relationship that in Chaos, Zeus can intentionally conduct the clouds and the storms and whip them up, but also it happens unintentionally as a result of his emotions. So it's a complicated, messy situation. So one thing that I think is interesting about Zeus's story in his childhood is that it really mirrors Dionysus's in a lot of ways, right? He was hidden away from his family, raised in the woods Zeus was raised by the nymphs and Dionysus was raised by the Maenads. So nymphs and Maenads are both female deities in ancient Greek mythology.
Lesser
they're not
deities.
Yeah, they're definitely not considered gods or goddesses, but they're mythological creatures. I'd say kind of in the same class as mermaids or harpies or sirens, what have you.
Sure.
Would that be fair?
I think so.
So nymphs specifically are typically tied to nature in some way or another. They either are nature spirits of a type of plant or natural feature, or they could be specific spirits of that place or of that specific tree. We have a lot of stories involving Zeus and nymphs which is even more frustrating when you realize that the nymphs are the ones who raised Zeus, and now he's just terrorizing them repeatedly. But many of the stories of Zeus's philandering involve nymphs. There are a few mortals that Zeus knocks up and knocks around with, but overwhelmingly, I'd say they're often nymphs. And we tend to think of Zeus and equate Zeus, by we, I mean modern folks, we tend to equate Zeus with the Christian god of creation, with the beard and living up in the sky and looking down on us. But Zeus isn't that type of paternal figure god. And he also didn't create the whole world. So we see that he has parents who are Titans, and he was raised by nymphs on Crete in a place that already existed. And he was born in a cave. So all of these features already existed. Zeus didn't bring the world into being, but he is the current ruler of the world. And there are multiple stories, like we spoke about in the Prometheus episode, of humanity being created once Zeus is already created, and several different rounds of that and what that looks like. But one important aspect of Zeus's childhood story is that the Fates were watching over him as he grew. And in the TV series Kaos, we see the Fates as these figures that kind of exist outside the hierarchy of the gods and the mortals, like bear their own presence outside of that. And that is true to the stories in ancient Greek mythology as well, that the Fates are doling out the prophecies. They have this overarching kind of like knowledge. And I would say that the Fates are probably the most powerful figures.
Something that repeatedly comes up throughout Greek mythology is that not even Zeus can escape fate, which is something really interesting that the show gets at, is that fate is almost an impersonal, unavoidable force that even the gods are bound by. And while Zeus can be seen as some sort of like arbiter of fate who can dictate when and where the other gods intervene in human affairs, and there's not much he can actually change. What he can change, and arguably what people can change about their own fate, is what their approach is to their fate, how they approach the conclusion of their prophecy. Is Zeus going to do it throwing a hissy fit like he does in Chaos, or is he going to meet it head on? Well, obviously Zeus is going to throw a hissy fit as he does it. In the Iliad, for example, Zeus is aware that his son Sarpedon will die, but he can't do anything about it because fate, not Zeus, governs the ultimate trajectory of life and the universe. So the Fates, or the Moirai, function independently of the gods, and they do so because they're meant to ensure that fate, by necessity, takes place without obstruction. And so I think that's something really interesting that the show gets at too, is that you see Zeus burning down the cave, trying to kill the Fates. But does he? No, it doesn't fucking matter what he does because he can't control fate. He was given his position as like the sky god of Olympus by basically drawing straws. Him, Poseidon, and Hades, by lottery, were each assigned their domain. I think Zeus is the worst. He's so fucking boring because he's the worst. All of his stories are the fucking same thing over and over and over again. He's this like rapey ass hoe who can't keep it in his pants because all of his power went to his pee-pee and he can't control himself. He is typically associated with justice and order and upholding the cosmic order as king of the gods. And the story of Sisyphus was the example that came up when I was researching this. So basically the story of Sisyphus goes that Sisyphus was a fucking asshole. He's this tyrannical king who violated all these sacred hospitality traditions by killing every visitor that came to his court to show how powerful he was. He ultimately betrays Zeus by revealing the location of a river nymph, I think. And so Zeus orders Thanatos, the god of death, to chain Sisyphus in Tartarus. Where have we heard this before? Sisyphus asks Thanatos to show him how the chains work. And he tricks Thanatos and then chains the god of death in Tartarus. and makes it so that nobody on Earth dies, which infuriates Ares, the god of war, because now war isn't fun because none of his opponents can die. So he's really pissed off. And Zeus decides to punish Sisyphus for his hubris and thinking that, hubris being his excessive pride and thinking that he could outsmart or be cleverer than Zeus. And Zeus punishes him by forcing him to push a boulder up a steep hill in Tartarus for all eternity, only for when it gets near to the top to roll back down. Thus, Sisyphus is doomed to an eternity of futile, fruitless effort. Which, in my mind, and this is one of the beefs that I have with the Christian God and idea of hell too, is like, you're alive for, 90 years on tops? That's a long, and killing people is not okay, to be clear. Sisyphus was a dick and should not have been behaving like that. But 90 years of fucking up is not equivalent to an eternity of suffering. It blows my mind that because you fucked up for this many years, you're now this is not justice. This is not equivocal at all. How is that balance? How is that harmony? How is that order? It's not. It's Zeus over-exercising his hurt feelings. Why doesn't Ares have to push a rock eternally up a hill in Tartarus? He killed more people for far longer than Sisyphus ever did. It's just a question to posit.
Well, I would say because Ares is
Ares was hot, wasn't he?
He's the personification of war, and war isn't just going to go away. So
it's fair.
He's just there. I know.
In a way, Zeus embodies the complexities of power. He's the archetype and manifestation of toxic masculinity and masculine power in excess and patriarchy. He's this unhinged, raw, selfish, destructive, dangerous, unchecked masculine energy who dominates and abuses his power and whose wrath is so swift. And it's these things, his infidelity, his virility, that often lead to chaos and familial discord and the victim being constantly punished. It is just the quote from Marvel that you read last time, with great power comes great responsibility. He cannot do it. He literally can't. No matter how hard he tries, he's trying to maintain cosmic order and restore balance because Sisyphus stopped everybody from dying, right? He's trying to get the circle of life, death, and rebirth back to where it should be. And he can't. He doesn't, because he took the insult so personally.
This is a great example of what not to do, how not to lead. He's the worst.
Yes.
It begs the question, how was Zeus seen in ancient Greece? What do contemporary sources say about him? Was he a respected and well-loved and revered in a way that, gave ancient Greek men permission to behave in this way? Or...
I was reading that soldiers would pray to him for protection for their safe return from battle. He was seen as a protector of men, if you will, so that kind of begs the question, what kind of protector of men?
Right. It's almost impossible to understand how people saw him in their time, right? Because the bulk of people, the everyday folks like you and me, wouldn't have had access to any sort of ways to keep these records. I mean, the fact that we even have access to these stories themselves is pretty phenomenal, right? And it's so hard for us to understand other societies because we bring our own cultural context and understanding into it, and we can't separate ourselves from our culture, right? Everything we know and understand about the world, we see through the eyes of the culture that we were raised. Even if we think that we disagree with it, our barometer for what's right and what's wrong comes to us from a cultural context as well. So
right, because morality and ethics are culturally defined.
And I think it's really important to note here too that when we talk about ancient Greece, it doesn't exist in the way that we think of Greece existing today. Ancient Greece was a collection of city-states, essentially, and Athenians identified and were culturally separate from Spartans and from the Minoans. It just, all the cultures around that area were separate and were different and had their own cultural context and their own understandings of these figures in these stories. And that's why we see, one of the reasons why we see so many different versions, right? But in pretty much every version of Zeus's stories that we have, we see him as just this total shitbag, and that's something that Kaos really gets right. And they depict Zeus as this casually callous man who is just so, like you said earlier, he takes everything so personally, and he uses that as a reason to punish people around him. In the first episode of Kaos, there's a scene where Dionysus is rude to Hera, and Zeus asks him to apologize, and Dionysus doesn't. And Zeus glares at him and uses his mind powers to have Dionysus slam his own face on the table repeatedly until he apologizes to Hera. And the look on both Zeus and Hera's face in this scene while they're doing this, they're getting so much joy and power out of it. And you could see why they connect and why they're attracted to each other.
I think you mentioned this in the last episode about Dionysus, but when he's doling out the meander water, I think is a good example of how petty he is, because he gives everybody full glasses except for Dionysus. Even though he's made Dionysus a full god, he still gives him only half a cup, and that is like soup's petty. I mean, the whole thing is super petty, but him giving Dionysus a half a cup is super, super petty.
It is. It's super, and it's like, it's like that casually cruel thing again, right? He's not just reminding Dionysus, he's reminding everybody,
right.
Like, I know exactly where everybody belongs in this hierarchy, and I'm not afraid to call it out, and it helps keep them in line, right?
Petty.
Yeah.
Petty ass hoe.
Petty ass hoe.
Zeus is a petty ass hoe, the end.
Yeah, I have a note here. In Kaos, is Zeus just so completely miserable? Because we see him in one scene listening to the confessions to the tongues in Hera's secret confession room. And it seems like he really takes so much delight and pleasure in making humans miserable and wretched. And it just makes me think of that saying, misery loves company. Like, there's so many different ways we can interpret that. And for me personally, I've been thinking a lot about that saying when I've been going through like hard times or I'm depressed, like, yeah, I'm miserable. And the thing that would make this better would be to be in company with people, right? Like, there's that part of it, but then there's the other part of it, like Zeus, where people who are miserable want everybody around them to be miserable too, and then that gives them some sort of power, because they have power over the other people's misery, and that makes them feel better somehow. I don't know, it's something that I don't fully understand as a human, because like, I don't want the people around me to be miserable. That makes me feel even worse if everybody's feeling bad. Zeus is toxic as fuck. So a famous story of Zeus and a nymph is with Echo. And while Echo wasn't necessarily the recipient of Zeus's attention, which good for her, girl, she lived in the woods, in the caves with other nymphs, and Zeus would very frequently come down and have his way with a selection of nymphs. And one day when he was down there doing his nasty ass thing, Hera got suspicious and came down to try to find him. And Echo knew that if Hera found any of her friends with Zeus, that they would immediately be punished, like seriously punished. And Kaos explores this. They show Hera turning them all into bees, and you see how many bees that she keeps. And so that's a nod to all these stories. So in this one specifically, Hera is trying to get past Echo. And I just see it as this, you know, that dance when you're walking in opposite direction as somebody and you like go like you can't get past each other. Echo is intentionally blocking Hera, and every time Hera tries to get around her, Echo's like, oh, so hey, so have you heard about this new thing? Have you heard about this new thing? What about this? What are you doing today? And she just keeps talking and blocking Hera, and it allows enough time for all of the nymphs to get free. And so Hera's pissed. Hera's super pissed. And so she curses Echo that she could only repeat the last thing somebody said to her so she could never start her own conversation again, and takes away her voice for the fucking crime of protecting her sisters from getting punished by a jealous wife. So Echo wanders around, and eventually there's other folks involved in this story, but she eventually fades away because she lost her autonomy and her agency, and all that's left of her is the curse that Hera gave, and she faded away in the caves in obscurity. And if you call her, you could still hear her returning the last thing of what you said from the mountains, and that's still where we get the word that we use for Echo today. And all of these stories of Zeus, they just involve the victims and the people around the victims being punished and Zeus getting away scot-free. The bulk of Zeus's stories, essentially, the pattern for his stories is Zeus is bored on Mount Olympus and spies some hot young thing who's a nymph or a mortal or fill in the blank, spies them, and he decides to go shoot his shot. And depending on what version you read, he seduces them or they seduce him, or whatever flowery bullshit language that folks use to dance around what was actually happening.
Or he disguises himself as a shower of gold and impregnates a woman, or...
Come on, there's one where he disguises himself as a golden shower.
Yes, and a flame of fire, I believe. As well as a bull, a swan.
Every story from our modern cultural context can be interpreted as sexual assault now, as some sort of rape or sexual assault. So there's, of course, the super famous depiction of Leda and the Swan. And this is a fun little Easter egg that we see in Kaos. Hanging up in the Olympic Palace is a painting of Leda and the Swan. And this is when Zeus came down and disguised himself as a swan and raped a woman, Leda. There's another famous story of a nymph named Io.
I was just going to say Io.
Turns into a bull. Let's talk about Io. And okay, I have to admit, I always want to call her Io.
E-I-E-I-O.
E-I-E-I-O. But it's Io. The way I see this situation going is that Zeus is hanging out with Io. He realizes Hera is going to come find them. And so, boop, he transforms Io into this white cow. And Hera walks up and she's like, "What's up, Zeus?" And he's like, "Nothing, just hanging." And she's like, "What's the deal with the cow?"
Just hanging with my pet cow.
Just hanging with this cow.
E-I-E-I-O, barnyard fun.
Yeah. Hera's like, "What's the deal with this cow?" And he's like, "Nothing, not a big deal, just a regular old cow." And Hera's like, "Great, if it's a regular old cow, then you won't care what I do with her, right?" And Zeus is like,
"I don't really want to give you my cow."
Yeah, like, this is my cow. And Hera's like,
"Go get your own cow, Hera."
So there's a back and forth, and eventually it ends with Zeus being like, "Yeah, Hera, you can take the cow," because of course it's just a cow, because if he were to say anything else, then he'd be caught in the act, and he'd rather subject this poor woman to a lifetime of misery than admit that he's a sack of shit.
Right.
So Io is trapped as this cow. And eventually her story brings her to wandering through the desert, getting pestered by this gadfly that she can never get rid of, poor thing. Which, it's so interesting. Like, you can see this in the natural world, right? Like, every person, I think, who's had an experience around a cow has seen them trying to get the flies off from around them. So that's something that's so beautiful about mythology, is it contains these mundane elements that connect us through the ages, right? And yeah, I don't know, mythology is so beautiful about humanity and all these little tiny details. So Io's wandering the desert as this cow, and Zeus is watching her, but he's powerless to stop her and fix anything for her, because if he did, then Hera would catch him. And that would be the worst thing, right? For Hera to catch him and scold him. So poor Io continues to wander the desert, and we brought up her story briefly in our Prometheus episode, because he's the one who told her to keep going and to have that hope. And she eventually makes her way to Egypt, and then she, in some stories, turns into the Egyptian goddess Isis. And I love how that bridges these two huge players in the ancient world. And so eventually things turn out great for Io. But moral of the story is Zeus is a dick.
Zeus is
and
a dick.
he is willing to watch people suffer and not care about it. And like I said, Kaos really explores this over and over and over again with the offhanded way that he is just so cruel.
Yeah, I
What are
think
you gonna say?
too, like, Zeus in the show, we see him constantly offended by and trying to meddle in human affairs. And I think back to, like, pre-Iliad, what started the Trojan War was Zeus making Paris, the prince of Troy, pick between three goddesses which one was the most beautiful, or some apple. Give the apple to the fairest of them all, right? I'll have to research this better. But basically, it's Zeus, like, meddling in human affairs that catalyzes this massive 10-year war of destruction and death that leads to so many people dying and then so many people wandering. He's just he's like poking the bear, is what I feel like Zeus does. If he's not being the bear, he's instigating shit.
Yeah, like he constantly needs to be the center of attention.
That, yes, exactly.
Like, and that's part of it, right? In Kaos, we see him, he wants there to be another tragedy. He wants there to be another war. He wants to give the people a reason to beg him for mercy.
Mm-hmm.
And if things are regular and reasonable and people are happy, then they have no reason to pay attention to him and they take him for granted. It's really, Kaos is really like humanizing Zeus in a way for me. And I know that that usually comes with more empathy, and this is not empathy that's building for me at all in regards to Zeus, but it's definitely helping me see him as the slime ball that he is. And I love how they have Jeff Goldblum wearing like the track suits and everything.
the gold chain, that watch, the gold Casio watch.
Something I find fun is that like we see in Kaos that Zeus is, this isn't a spoiler because they haven't gone into this in the series, so I don't know what it's going to be, but my personal take on this is we see that time's almost up for the Olympians, right? Like their way of life is not sustainable. Their way of approaching the mortals is not sustainable. I think Dionysus is going to have something big to do with it because he's straddling that liminal space as far as the TV series goes. But in the style of the Olympians, in the technology of the Olympians as portrayed in Kaos, you see that they're from an earlier generation, that they're not like up to it. I don't know. Geez, have you seen like the phones that they're using? It's all very 80s technology. It's very like 80s styling in the whole palace and everything. And I'm wondering if that's intentionally because they're showing that they're part of like a world that does no longer exist, right? Like
society's moving forward.
Remnants, society's moving. They're the royal family that nobody cares about anymore, right? That they're just figureheads. They're photo ops. They're,
something to remember fondly of olden days.
And I mean, even Poseidon, right? Like the excess and the luxury that he has is on this like very, I don't know, to me it's like this like 1980s 90s Wall Street idea of what success looks like. It looks like a big luxury yacht. It looks like gold hardware. Right? Like it's kind of tacky, it's kind of outdated, but it's all very like in your face loud. Zeus is completely removed. And if we look at this in a religious sense, it kind of makes me think of the story of the Buddha, which also is similar to the story of Princess Jasmine in Disney's Aladdin, right? Someone who has grown up completely privileged and sheltered and doesn't understand what it's like to be human, to be a mortal, to be a regular person. And Zeus is the same type. He's like a billionaire who's completely divorced from reality. He's like Lucille 1. It's a banana, Michael. What could it cost? $12. that's Zeus's vibe, right? Like completely out of touch, old rich person, and coming back to the old tech and the old stylings that they have, right? It's this like glamour and opulence and luxury from a time period where those were things that impressed regular people, right? Like the 80s was a time of opulence where if you couldn't afford it, you wanted to look like you could afford it.
Right.
And now we kind of have an opposite of that, where people who are flashing their wealth are seen as tacky. And some of the richest people in the world, like Adam Sandler, go out wearing gym shorts and giant t-shirts. And it's a completely different status symbol in society that we have today than in the 80s. And it just speaks to even more how out of touch Zeus is. Here's another note. Zeus is fucking insane.
But I think like what the show so aptly sums up about Zeus is, and it does, like you're saying, really humanize him. I feel like hearing these stories of Zeus that are all this redundant, same story over and over and over again, it's really easy to distance yourself from them and just be like, oh, he was this gross ass archaic figure, right? But in seeing this representation of him as an 80s slime ball, suddenly it becomes like a lot more real. And these myths take on like a new flavor almost. And you see, you know, him taking this little thing personally and it having his unchecked rage from taking that little thing personally, causing destruction and suffering. Him using excessive force to solve his problems suddenly isn't just this random story you heard in grade school about him turning a lady into a cow. It's suddenly like, oh shit, this is a like
that this kind of power unchecked, right, and this kind of ego. And
yeah,
in episode 3, Zeus says that blasphemy without consequence is dangerous, and that's how petty he is, that even one person speaking negatively about him, like he's the definition of a micromanager. He's like the absolute worst. This is working in corporate America, y'all. The worst human, you know, who is somehow in a position of power, who is able to dictate and
become president,
hire and fire and yeah, become president, right? Like, we're living in a world where Zeus still reigns. When I was in school, I wrote a paper on the Me Too movement, and I was specifically talking about Roman mythology, but there's a huge overlap. So for those who aren't super familiar with the difference between ancient Greek and ancient Roman mythology, ancient Greek mythology is our source text, basically, like it's the foundation for these stories. And then during the Roman Empire and Roman colonization, a lot of these stories were borrowed and refashioned, reinterpreted, and a lot of these figures were given updated Latin Roman names. So a lot of our understanding of Greek mythology comes to us from Roman sources. So there's a lot of overlap. And one of those sources is Ovid's Metamorphoses.
I also wrote a paper on Me Too and Ovid's Metamorphoses, but I can't find it. And I don't remember what it was about.
Oh, man. That was what I explored in this paper, talking about how over and over again throughout Ovid's Metamorphoses, women's descent is not acknowledged, and as a result, they lose their agency. And obviously, like, we can still see that practice happening in Western society. As women, oftentimes our roles are defined in context to the men around us, and it just overwhelming. I would consider modern American culture as like a cultural descendant of ancient Greek and ancient Roman culture, right? A lot of our laws, our structures, our morals are built on a foundation of these ancient Greek and Roman stories and philosophies. And over 2,000 years later, like, we haven't moved on. But instead of metamorphosizing, we are stuck in a repetition, like a caterpillar emerging from the supposedly transformative cocoon. We're emerging in the same form as before, and these cycles keep happening over and over and over again. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, in the way that Ovid tells the story of Zeus and Io, Zeus specifically tells Io to not be afraid of the savage beasts that hide in the shadows, and that it's okay to seek shade and comfort in that shade, and that he would be watching out for her. And that just feels so powerful to me, because in a society that's run by this patriarchal Zeus energy, like we have going on in our structures now, it's not the people hiding in the shadows you have to be afraid of. They're the ones hiding from Zeus. It's the men who feel confident and strong enough to stand in the full sunlight and take ownership for all the fucking shitty things that they're doing and still have the power and still be able to do the shitty things. Like, those are the people we need to be afraid of. We just see this like men's abuse of power over and over and over again. And like we'll explore next week when we get to Hera, the way that her wrath and her feelings and her story is described is completely different. We see her just in her proximity to power around Zeus most often. And Zeus, we see this in Kaos as well, that Hera and Poseidon are constantly trying to keep Zeus in check, Hera especially. And we see that she's the one who, it reminds me of that. Is it a Greek saying? It's from My Big Fat Greek Wedding, so I'm assuming it's Greek. But they said the man is the head of the family and the woman is the neck who turns the head. And I feel like Kaos is really exploring this with the dynamic between Zeus and Hera, that Zeus is the one who's making all these decisions and like actually putting action to the thoughts. Hera is the one who is reminding him, like, remember, Zeus, like, this is one blasphemer. It is beneath you. Don't do it. Or, oh, these things are going on in Crete, like, call Poseidon, delegate. The power is in the delegation. And so you can see that Zeus is not capable of being the leader. Like, he's just simply the figurehead that people are trying to rein in and make sure he does as little damage as possible, which is like not a great leader in my opinion.
No, he's a fucking moron.
We hate Zeus.
He's just like, man, I like don't have really anything nice to say about him at all.
Well, here's one nice thing. Zeus had a lot of kids, and his kids did some cool things. So here's a small list of some of his kids.
My small list is like 20 names long of his children.
I know, I'm being facetious.
Oh.
So he's the father of the 9 muses, and he had them with the Titan Mnemosyne. Mnemosyne? How do you say her name?
I feel like every time we don't know. We've gone over this with this specific name before.
Fuck me. I know, I always avoid it because but her name is the root of our modern word for memory, which I love. So there you go. Mnemosyne. With Metis, who you mentioned at the beginning here, he has Athena. With the Titan Leto, he has Apollo and Artemis. With the nymph Maya, he has Hermes. With his wife Hera, finally, he has Ares.
The god of war.
The god of war. And Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth. Sometimes he's depicted as the father of Aphrodite. With Leda, he had Helen and Clytemnestra, the famous Helen of Troy, Helen of Sparta. Also, he's the father of King Minos with Europa. He's the father of Perseus and Heracles, both of those with 2 different human women.
So in some myths, he's the father of the Fates.
Yes, I have that written down here. Morai.
Also,
sometimes he's the father of the Morai, which is confusing.
It is. Also Hecate, sometimes.
And Persephone, him and Demeter. So
Pan.
A very complicated pantheon going on here.
Man, he is, in some senses, I think I got into this a little bit with Dionysus, but what? Why are you making that face?
He's like that guy that made all those deposits to the sperm bank and now has like 100 kids and they all found out.
Oh yeah, I did. I watched that documentary. Yeah, I did. I watched it. And it's like all these kids, they're like, I'm child number 84. And they're sitting there like, this is child number 67.
Big Zeus energy there. Big Zeus energy.
No, I was thinking about, I got into this a little bit in our last episode. In Greco-Roman society, it wasn't, I know I feel like I keep using the word binary over and over and over again, but it was something that I call, and I think others have probably also called, the sliding scale of masculinity. instead of duality between penis owner and vagina owner, male, female, woman, man, however you want to call it, you have this scale of manly man to unmanly or unmen. So at the top of manly men, you have figures like, I want to say
Heracles.
Heracles, yes. He's strong and masculine and, you know, head of the household, owns property, has a wife.
He's Gaston.
He eats 12 dozen eggs for breakfast. Like, self-control was a really big qualifier for if one was a manly man. Being virile, like having children and slaves and property and yada, 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 yada. Like, stereotypical signifiers of what they called a paterfamilias, or the patriarch of the family. All the way at the other end, you have unmen, which is where you have eunuchs and women and slaves and people who could not ever perform masculinity to such an extent. So there's all this space in between, and masculinity, it was constantly in flux. It was constantly in question. Every action was carefully curated to make sure that you didn't slide further back down this sliding scale of masculinity, right? Like, you constantly wanted to be performing towards being a manly man. And so Zeus, in a lot of ways, does embody what a Greco-Roman manly man looked like. He was powerful and victorious in battle. He was in control of other people. He had the gods at his beck and call. He had, you know, a bazillion children, which proves that he was super fruitful from the loin and all these things. But then at the same time,
and he earned his place on Mount Olympus through like a battle,
right,
through winning a war.
Sure, absolutely. And at the same time, he is the epitome of a lack of self-control. And I think that's something that we've been getting at and saying over and over and over again, is this is what happens when this archetype of masculinity spins out of control. You go from being able to see Zeus as this epitome of masculinity to this unman because he has no self-control. You hurt his feelings and he's not stoic anymore. He is absolutely unhinged. He is on Earth raping people and throwing a hissy fit, and it just goes to show like how complicated, for one, performances of gender really are, no matter who you are and what time period you live in. There are healthy versions of masculine energy, right? But Zeus is not them. You can't look at Zeus as a role model for even Greco-Roman masculinity.
Or is that where his power lies, though? By showing the fallibility of men, like showing that even the gods can't do it right, and so then it gives permission to mortals to also be imperfect. I mean, obviously in a very dangerous, shitty, terrible way.
I like want to say yes, but his ways are like he's out of control and now the world is smote and women are cows. But yeah, like,
and it's like, yeah, like he's giving permission for men to be abusive and to deal with their emotions in that way, like creating a society where that's a norm.
I would like to insert here that...
That's what Zeus said. I would like to insert here.
No, Zeus wouldn't say it. He would just do it without asking. Also, I was thinking today, you know, I bet Zeus is really bad in bed. Like, he is not...
Oh, yeah, he's the worst.
He's just like,
and
wham, bam,
who
thank
gives
you,
him
man.
Bad feedback. Yeah, and he's that guy who, like, he's already dressed, and he's like, you came, right?
Yeah. Have you seen...
He's like buttoning his pants. He's like, yeah, you came, right? Yeah. Yep. That's great.
He is not like Dionysus.
He's one of those guys that's tweeting that, like, it's unnatural for women to get wet, and he should know because he's never made his wife wet. He's like one of those guys.
He's the Ben Shapiro of the ancient world.
Yes. But yeah.
Can't even remember where...
Like, just the opposite of Dionysus.
Yes, exactly. Right? No consideration for your pleasure.
He's that guy that comes in your mouth without warning you first.
Here's the thing. I don't think Zeus has ever had a blowjob, because if he put his dick in my mouth, I would bite that motherfucker off so fast. Right? Like, if he's raping...
Yeah, but then if you did, you would, like, immediately explode.
It would be worth it. Have you ever seen It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia? The Dennis method? My thought was, during that episode,
You think that Zeus is Dennis? Zeus is a Dennis.
Zeus
God,
is a
that's
Dennis.
great.
Dennis is a commentary on all the Zeuses in the world, right? Like, he's making fun of them. But in that episode specifically, Mac is talking about watching Dennis's pornos, and he's like, they're all that weird angle where it's just the back of your balls going like this. That's exactly how I think of Zeus fucking. Like, it's just like 2 hip thrusts, weird ball angle over and out. You came, right? And then he dips.
Yeah, you heard it here first, y'all. Zeus is Dennis. Shit. What's his last name?
Who?
What's their last name in
Zeus?
that show?
Reynolds?
No, Dennis and D. Reynolds.
The Dennis method.
So in conclusion, fuck Zeus. We hate you. Jeff Goldblum, we love you.
Fuck the gods. Isn't that what Eurydice says? Fuck.
We defy
the gods.
Fuck the gods.
Thanks for joining us, everybody, on this episode of The Mything Link.
I'm Randall.
I'm Caitlin.
And we will see you next week. Goodbye. Thanks for listening to The Mything Link. You can find the reference list in the show notes for further research. The Mything Link is researched and recorded by Drs. Randall Ulyate and Caitlinn Curry. Edited by Dr. Caitlinn Curry. With music by Mark Austin Kelton. The Mything Link is produced by Fernweh Collective Incorporated, a humanities nonprofit based in San Diego, California. As a small nonprofit, we appreciate if you have the time to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help grow our audience. For more information on our organization, head over to fernwehcollective.org. Thanks for listening. Hera isn't putting it out, and so he's involuntarily celibate, and so he be raping all the mortals. It's raping everybody in here. Hide your kids, hide your wife.